And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote. Michael C. Frank is David and Lucille Packard Professor of Human Biology at Stanford University and Director of the Symbolic Systems Program. He received his PhD from MIT in Brain and Cognitive Sciences in 2010, and he studies language use and language learning, focusing especially on early word learning. He's the founder of the Many Babies Consortium. It's a collaborative replication network for infancy research, and he's led open data projects including WordBank and MetaLab. He was a Jacobs Foundation Fellow and has received the Trollin Award for the National Academy of Sciences, the FAB's Early Career Impact Award, and the MAR Prize. He has served as chair of the governing board of the Cognitive Science Society and has edited journals including Cognition and Child Development. I'm going to stop sharing now and welcome Michael.
Hello, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. All right, can you just confirm that you see my screen and everything looks good?
Yep, looks great.
Wonderful. Okay. So thanks very much for having me here, and I'm very excited to connect with this community, which I didn't know about before the invitation, and I think there's a lot of interesting commonalities here. So my goal with this talk is to tell you the story of how I went from somebody who basically just studied kids language acquisition to somebody who builds data repositories, and to tell you a little bit about what I've learned along the way. I suspect that many of these lessons will resonate with the work that all of you do, perhaps more so than my work on child language. And so I'm really eager to hear about these connections in terms of building tools and building repositories and thinking about the challenges of sharing data publicly. So I'm going to try to talk for about 40 minutes or so, giving us plenty of time for a robust discussion. And I'm really enthusiastic to hear from all of you. So let me just start by mentioning the problem that I study, which is language learning. Language learning is one of the key puzzles of cognitive science. Children go in just a few short years from speechless, wordless infants to toddlers who can use language to make their way through the world, to children who use language fluently to interact with the world and to learn from the knowledge and the communities around them. This is just an amazing transformation, and it's very common. It's essentially ubiquitous among typically developing children. And yet our theories of how this process unfolds are sadly lacking. So here's an example of what you might see in a child development textbook or a website about early language development. And what you see is a series of descriptions of children's behavior, summaries of stages that children go through, and so forth. Yet these kinds of summaries don't provide us with a mechanistic understanding of what's happening psychologically that drives this process forward. Of course, there are many such studies trying to understand these processes. That's the literature that I connect to and contribute to. But we don't have a mechanistic understanding that really summarizes these in a unifying theoretical framework. And that's very important stuff because early language lays the groundwork for children's success in school and in life more broadly. And so when we want to do early interventions, when we want to identify children at risk, when we want to provide remediation for children who have language delays or disorders, we need those theories to build smart interventions that have the best chance of success. So my research program is basically that. I try to build good theories of children's language learning using tools from statistics and from machine learning. And this is what I've been doing throughout my career. Been trying to make these kinds of quantitative theories that make predictions about children's behavior. And the specific domain of language learning that I look at is early word learning. Early word learning is this wonderful case study for all of a child's cognition, because early word learning typically takes place in complex, interactive, grounded situations where you have a child and a caregiver interacting around many objects, playing, engaging in social routines, and so forth. And during that wonderful dance of play, children have to figure out, for example, that the word doggy refers to the stuffed dog that's in front of them and maybe other dogs, but not other stuffed animals. So this is a picture from my dissertation work where I created a statistical model of this kind of process. This model was a small machine learning artifact, a piece of code essentially, that claimed to summarize some of what we knew about this process of early word learning. It was essentially not a black box because we could look at the assumptions, we could look at the code, but maybe a gray box here, a learning model that instantiated a scientific hypothesis about learning. And I think this was a success, and several models that came after it were also successful in summarizing this literature in different ways and instantiating different scientific hypotheses about learning. But when we scratch under the surface of how this model is being trained and evaluated, it starts to look less good. I'm embarrassed to say that the predictors, the training data for this model was 20 minutes worth of annotated video, and it was annotated by me. So I took videos and I created a schematic coding scheme, and I went through and summarized which objects were present in the field of view of the child and what the mom was looking at and what the child was touching. And this was all just a symbolic code of some videos that were publicly available at the time. And when I evaluated this model, what I evaluated on was a handful of binary experimental results. So children at age 18 months do, whatever that means, perform above chance at this particular phenomenon. Or I tried to reproduce those general ages and stages descriptions of average developmental changes. And as I tried to move forward from this work and really elaborate it and create a more quantitative predictive framework with more data, I realized I had essentially run out of data. This is what happened when I started my first job as an assistant professor. I tried to extend this model and I just didn't have the data to look at what came next. Around this same time, there was a movement happening that made me really concerned also about the data that I was using. That was the open science movement. So here's some terminology from the open science movement. It's a broad movement about, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but it's about generally the role of transparency and verifiability in scientific progress. And so in this movement, people started to develop terminology for the different things that you might want from a particular claim in the literature. You might want it to be reproducible, which means if you had the data that was underlying that claim, say you had the open data from that paper, you could get the same numbers as were reported in the paper. You might also want, if it was an empirical claim, you might want it to be replicable. That is, you could actually get the materials, maybe remake them or get them from the author, and you could run the experiment again with a new sample from that same population, and you would get the same basic result. And of course, there's a lot of work being done by the word same here. So comparable results is always a question. And these two things, reproducibility and replicability, are prerequisites for the kind of theory evaluation that I was interested in doing. If the data sets you're trying to fit to, or the empirical results you're trying to fit to, are not reproducible or replicable, then you're really fitting your data to noise. Sorry, you're fitting your theory to noise. And of course, the eventual goal here is to create a generalizable theory, not just fitting to these particular observations, but to get a broad enough set of observations to really be able to summarize this process. And around this time, I started to get personally very, very worried about reproducibility and replicability. So just let me start with replicability, which was our first concern, that we might not be able to repeat many of the experiments that were present in this literature and get the same results. And this was starting to be a concern across all of psychology and really all across the biomedical sciences as well. So this is a summary of essentially 10 years worth of work on replicability. This is a complex graph, but I think it's an impactful one, so let me walk you through it. So what's being plotted on the horizontal axis here is the original effect size from a series of different independent experiments that were published in the literature. And on the vertical, you see the replication of the original effect size, with 0 being an exact replication. You get the same effect in the new experiment as you did in the old one, and that's exactly what you want. If you've got a big effect in the old one, you get a big effect in the new one, and small effect, and so forth. And each of these panels here shows a different large-scale replication study where 100 papers were selected, or 20 papers, or 94 papers were selected from the literature and replicated by independent teams. And what you see in essentially all of these large-scale studies is this negative trend, such that if you had a small effect in the original, you get a small effect in the replication. But if you had a large effect in the original, it tends to get a lot smaller. It's about half as big on average. So that's not good. The only panel where this is not the case is this particular study that tried to follow best practices throughout, including pre-registering all of their hypotheses and analyses ahead of time to avoid inflating their effect sizes. And sure enough, in that case, if you got they didn't get any large effects. So there's nothing over on this side of the graph, which is suspicious altogether. But when they got medium-sized effects in the original, they got medium-sized effects in the replication. The final feature of this graph that's a little distressing is these unfilled circles are replication failures in which the original result was statistically significant and the replication was not. And there are quite a lot of these across the different samples of studies to replicate. So, okay, I hope you see now how this is not the pattern of data you want on a graph like this. On a graph like this, you would want straight lines all across, and you'd want all the circles to be filled, and that's not what we see. We see a really fairly high rate of replication failure in the psychological literature more broadly, and that was very distressing to me as a theorist, because I was trying to make theories of these points, and maybe I was making theories of the magnitude or even the existence of an observation that actually was down here on the graph. And really, I shouldn't have spent any time trying to theorize about that at all because it was simply not replicable. So in other words, I started to feel like we were in bad shape for really evaluating these scientific hypotheses about learning. And that led me to the research program that I've been working on for the past 10 years, which is to try to do quantitative theory evaluation with more and better data. And in many cases, what I'm interested in is aggregating existing data to create more robust data sets to meet this need. All right, so I don't know if anybody on this talk has seen this movie, Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. It's a classic movie of the 80s. So I like to think of my data sharing journey as starting with the Field of Dreams model. So in Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner's character has this idea: if he builds a baseball diamond in the middle of his Iowa cornfield, people are going to come there to watch games, and he's going to be able to save his farm where the baseball field is. It's going to bring in the revenue that allows him to keep his family on this farm. And I began with the model that I think has been common for many folks in the data sharing field. If you build a compelling interface for data sharing, that's our baseball diamond in this Field of Dreams analogy, then researchers are going to dust off their files and deposit them in the repositories we build. They're going to drive out to that cornfield and come see the game, and it's going to be glorious. So let me tell you about this journey. There are 3 theses to this talk. The first thesis is that mandates for data sharing are a start, but they really aren't enough to make people come visit the cornfield. The second is that one model for moving forward is to create domain-specific data repositories. And I suspect this should resonate with members of the current community. And these domain-specific data repositories should store data, not just in general, but data about theoretically relevant constructs for that particular field and that set of scientific questions. And then my hope here that I'm going to try to argue for is that these repositories themselves create incentives to change the data sharing process that are as powerful as the kind of mandates that we might have initially started with from a policy perspective. Okay, let me take you on this journey. So as people started to get interested in issues of replicability and reproducibility, really when I say interested here, I mean worried, there were a whole host of policy responses. One is the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, which was a set of policies for journals. And I think these have had generally a very positive impact, providing a policy template for what journals should say about publishing data, about publishing code, about pre-registration, and so forth. And I was very interested at this time around 2014, 2015 in what these policies did. And I got an opportunity to see up close and personal because I was invited to be an associate editor, screening papers and getting editorial decisions for a journal called Cognition, which has a long and storied history in our field. It's a wonderful journal, it's a disciplinary journal, but it has been really at the forefront of publishing a lot of interesting work on the nature of the mind. And I got this opportunity in part because a guy named Steve Sloman took over as editor-in-chief of the journal. And Steve, being a wonderful contrarian, said, I don't hold with all this stuff that's outside our field of, talking about data sharing. I'm not really interested in, these kind of big policy initiatives. I'm just going to mandate data sharing from the start because it's just the right thing to do. And so he said, I'm just going to institute this data transparency policy, and authors of all published papers will be asked to make their data publicly available. You just have to archive on acceptance. And in some sense, coming in 2015, 2014, this was pretty progressive and exciting that he would just mandate this for everyone. And I was really interested in what this policy did and how the mandate operated. So I had the good fortune at that time to work with a wonderful postdoc and meta scientist named Tom Hardwick, who assembled a very large team, actually twice in a row, to evaluate this kind of journal policy intervention. So I'll tell you about the first one primarily. So he got together lots of folks who were interested in this issue in order to take on the mammoth task of looking at policy compliance in articles in Cognition before and after the policy went into place. And this creates really the first systematic case study of what's called analytic reproducibility, getting the same numbers from raw data sets as are in the published paper. And then this isn't the first one across all fields, but I think it's the first one in psychology specifically. So here's what actually happened. So what's being plotted here on the horizontal is time, and the policy was put in place in March 2015, and we coded about a year and a half worth of post-policy data, as well as several years pre-policy. And what we coded, first of all, was the proportion of articles with a data availability statement. So what you see is pre-policy, you do not have a lot of articles with a data availability statement, although there is an upward trend. But after the policy, you see this pretty quick rise up. So that from pre-policy, it's about 22%. After the policy, the numbers are going up. But when we dug more deeply into these data sets, not all of them were actually really reusable. That is, there were data missing, there were incomplete metadata, and so forth. So post-policy, we had about 63% reusability. So even though the policy really did have we believe a causal impact, as shown in part by this discontinuity in the regression line, we're still only getting about 2/3 of the data being reusable. And that's a problem for policy compliance. It really suggested to us, as we communicated back to the journal, that you needed more review of the data sets, you needed better guidelines around the metadata, and generally you needed to work towards better policy compliance in order to actually have these policies produce uniform outcomes. So this was, I think, an interesting evaluation, but what was maybe a little bit more unique about this study was that we actually then took a random sample of these reusable data sets, downloaded them, and then actually tried to reproduce the conclusions in the published paper. And this was very labor-intensive work. That explains why the team for this paper was so big, because these are like wonderful data crossword puzzles. You download the data, and then you have to try to reassemble from the puzzle of the instructions, the clues given in the paper, what the actual numbers were. And what we found for 35 of these in the cognition study and 25 of them in a later study of psychological science, another journal with an open data type policy, we found that only 1/3 of these papers were analytically reproducible from the actual raw data downloaded that were marked as reusable. So in only 1/3 of cases could we reproduce all the numbers in a published analysis. And this was just one analysis in a paper that sometimes had many, many different analyses. So it was essentially one paragraph of the results section. So we found this very dispiriting, but we didn't stop there. We reached out to the original authors for these papers, and we got a very good author response rate. And even with the help of the original authors, we could only track down every single number in about 2/3 of cases. And this was true across these two independent samples. What went wrong here? Well, in these cases, we saw many, many, many numerical issues throughout the analytic pipeline. These were not complex analyses. These were often issues in simple reporting, for example, typos, or issues in reporting a confidence interval and what formula was used, or issues in the data exclusion pipeline resulting in minor numerical differences. In no cases here, reproducibility issues led to serious undermining of the substantive conclusions, but there were 3 cases that were unclear where authors did commit to publishing an erratum on their paper, which is quite a high rate of errata, of corrections based on this study. But really from the perspective of somebody trying to reuse these data, it meant that open data were not really reusable. We couldn't really just go from these open data sets to interesting new model-based analyses. It took 5 to 25 person hours for each study in this paper. So times 35 to try to get a sense of whether we could really get the numbers out. I had a particularly graphic analogy that Tom liked to use. He said that this is these puzzles of reproducing people's analytic conclusions from their data was like putting together flat pack furniture with just a vague set of verbal instructions. Yeah, put the screws in the corner. Okay, now snap the whole thing together. And as anybody who's shopped at IKEA knows, without very careful adherence to very strict directions, the exercise often ends in disaster. Okay, so what's the way forward? For me, this came through thinking about domain-specific data repositories. And so I'll tell you a bit about that now. So the world of open data is broad, and there are many amazing resources out there: Figshare, the Open Science Framework, the Dataverse Project, Databrary, which I'll mention a bit later. These are amazing resources, but they store completely unstructured data from a zillion different projects with no metadata standards. There's no way to just say, hey, what are these data about? The answer is they're about everything. They're about all the different constructs and theories and measurements that people in psychology and more broadly in the behavioral sciences are interested in. So how do we use these data for specific theoretical goals? Let's start from our theory of language learning. It turns out that the data that people care about in language learning are structured around a shared theory, which is a vague theory, but it's a really, nevertheless, a very influential framework. And the framework is that children get what's called language input. Some of that input is child-directed and some is overheard. And then that input is processed in the moment through a variety of psychological processes of inference, prediction, so that the child can interpret it in the moment. And that leads to the accretion of knowledge about the language, which lets them comprehend and produce language, showing evidence of their learning. So psychological theories like this help us make sense of the relationship between different measurements that we make. And in this case, we do a lot of measuring of language input. We do a lot of measuring of processing and a lot of measuring of learning. And so what I've been doing is building resources around each of these. So for the measurement of language input, we have video corpora and transcript corpora. These are sets of interactions that children and their caregivers have gone into that can be used as input data for models. We have a repository of children's language processing, and that's called PeakBank, reflecting it's archiving the gaze of many different children on different stimuli and the automatic eye tracking that people have done in my field. And then we have a corpus of children's learning outcomes called WordBank, which is really our flagship project that I'll tell you about in just a moment. But before I do that, I just want to make one mention again of open science here. So open science is often thought of just around transparency and verifiability as ways of trying to make sure that the scientific literature is bedrock solid. Right. I talked about it. Okay, we want to share data so that we can figure out where numbers in a paper come from so we can reproduce them and so forth. And that's really a sense of open science almost as a stick rather than a carrot, that open science is all about making sure that you're in compliance with the policy. But I don't think that's where the benefits of transparency stop. In fact, I think open science is a key approach that enables faster research progress, that as we use transparent methods and we store data together, we actually enable faster research, we enable discovery, we enable pooling of information to really push our fields forward. And so I think in order to make a culture shift towards open science, we have to show people the exciting things that can happen when data are open. And these projects that I'm about to show you are my attempt to do that. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the very good antecedents for open data sharing in the field of child language. So this is CHILDIS or CHILDS. It's the Child Language Data Exchange System. And this is the granddaddy original big data for child language. So well before anybody was talking about big data in other fields, well before the current move to open science, Brian McWhinney and his collaborators who built CHILDIS were exchanging all of the available transcripts. These are kind of written transcripts of children's speech and caregiver speech to children in an open research environment with open tools and resources. So essentially, this made a model where everybody in child language, when they take tape recordings of a child playing with their caregiver and transcribe them and analyze those for a particular reason in their PhD thesis, they then contribute those transcripts to Childis, and that becomes part of the impact of their work. And so I think this is just an incredible antecedent for our field that suggests that collaboration can really drive research forward. In my work, I've focused on a second wonderful antecedent, which also actually had a tradition of data sharing and material sharing. And this is an instrument called the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. That's a mouthful, so we call it the CDI. The CDI is very simple. We call it an instrument, but it's really, like a microscope or something, but it's just a survey. And this is a survey that we give to parents where they bubble in what words their child says, or in some cases, what words their child says and understands. So they go through the 680 words on this form, and they bubble in, does your child know alligator? Do they say alligator? Do they say animal? Do they say ant? And so forth, all the way through zebra, and then onward through other different categories of words. These surveys, it turns out, are surprisingly useful for child language. They are reliable and valid ways to measure a very young child's language. And they're very cheap to administer because you just have to email them or mail them to the caregivers and then score them when they're filled in. That provides, in turn, a really nice screening mechanism for identifying early language disorders. It provides a nice way of measuring children's language skills before they come into the lab, and so forth. And because they're cheap, easy, and reliable, they've been a really important part of the toolkit for child language researchers around the world. And so tremendous amounts of effort has actually gone into adapting these instruments for different languages. When I started thinking about how to evaluate my models of early language learning, these data naturally came to mind. I started thinking, wow, this is a really amazing opportunity. And so around 2014, my collaborators and I got together and planned a site called WordBank. The idea with WordBank was that this would be an open database of children's vocabulary development, where we'd archive CDI data from around the world, from whoever would give them to us, and we'd allow those data to be downloaded and manipulated in a uniform format so that they could be in turn used as a way of evaluating models. We started this project out, and we were very happy to get a set of data contributions from a variety of authors. You can see Norwegian data were very well represented in the early data set, English, Danish, Turkish, and so forth. We call this figure the snail, reflects the diversity of languages in the data set. By 2019, we were up to 75,000 children with more than 29 languages or dialects. And we just pushed out a new revision to the site this summer, actually, including data from children with language disorders, including bilinguals, and now including 40 languages or dialects. So there's plenty of work to do to increase the linguistic diversity of the cultures and languages that are represented here. In particular, we're very heavy on Indo-European languages compared with other language families around the world, but we're definitely the most definitive cross-linguistic resource for learning about children's early vocabulary and early language outcomes. And when I show this figure, I don't often highlight where each of these data sets come from, but really fundamentally, this wasn't a case of Field of Dreams where people just showed up and gave us data. Instead, we have as a team a spreadsheet of people that I email and beg and plead with to try to share their data, to talk about the different data sharing norms and what they themselves can get from sharing data from this repository. So for example, this little dot here for the American Sign Language data set, it's a wonderful, rich data set that tells us about visual language acquisition. That's a set of paper forms that I picked up from somebody's driveway in the East Bay. So I drove kind of an hour and a half, and they agreed to deposit the data from their thesis in WordBank, and they left a pile of papers in a paper sack on their doorstep. And we digitized those and put them in the database. There were some permissions issues around Parisian French CDIs, a wonderful team, but they were trying to navigate different adaptation issues and different privacy issues. And so on a Paris trip in 2017, we worked that out. The Korean data set came from a family trip where my family and I went to visit the originator of the Korean CDI adaptation in Seoul, and so forth and so on. So each of these data sets has a story behind it. And through this process, we came to realize the importance of proper licensing and citation norms. So here are our licensing and citation policies. We make it clear that somebody who's publishing or presenting on WordBank needs to cite the publications linked to the data set. You also need to cite the database itself. We've got a policy if you're using every single data set or more than 5 data sets, then there's kind of a courtesy case if you have space limitations. We also, as a result of some authors' interests, we use a CC non-commercial license for some data sets where we just have CC with attribution, CC BY for others. And we now have a versioning policy where you get date of download information when you pull in the data set. And so on this page, you then see the attribution information for every single data set. And when you download a data set, it comes with that attribution information. And this has become critical for us as we make the case that folks really need to think about the impact of their data collection when they do CDI data collection. And by giving their data to us, they can actually increase the impact of their own work. That it's not a service to us to share with WordBank, it's a service to them because that increases their visibility and impact. They can show that to their funders, they can show that to their colleagues and say, hey, look, I'm part of this international team and I'm getting citation and credit through that process. But of course, the fun thing about creating a data resource for me is that you can then play with it. And so one of the things that we did with WordBank, taking advantage of the new R Shiny ecosystem that was coming out at that time, this is a set of tools for creating web-based data visualization apps. We created a set of interactive exploration tools. So here's an example of what you can do. This is kind of online exploration. So here we're selecting from our list of languages. We'd say we take German. So we see the size of the child's vocabulary by their age. We can split it up by different variables like gender. Maybe just look at a simple summary statistic like the median. And there we see a female advantage in the learning of German. So is that true in Korean? Well, it turns out it is. The red line is above the blue line again. And maybe we look at Swedish as another language. And again, we see different data, but the same female advantage. So this kind of interactive exploration can be very powerful for trying to form hypotheses about children's language, generally see cross-linguistic differences. And we're very encouraged to see that a lot of labs that study child language actually use this in their teaching. So they create interactive exercises around the use of WordBank. These interactives are very convenient and very useful, but they're part of and built on a broader principle, which is easy API or application programming interface access to the data set. So a key principle of WordBank has been to create an R programming interface where people can pull in the data quickly as part of a computational pipeline that's reproducible. And this is documented as a package called WordBanker, where you can pull in data through simple calls like get administration data, get instrument data, get language data, and so forth. And so this allows you then to manipulate the data. And indeed, that's very much what we've done with them, kind of going through the basic data science and modeling pipeline to try to understand cross-linguistic variation in children's language learning. And if this were a different talk, I'd then launch into a long description of some of the cross-linguistic principles of language learning that we've discovered from this data set. And if folks are interested in that, I'd love to share some of that work. But since this is primarily a talk about resources, I'll move on and come back to Kevin Costner and Field of Dreams. So the lesson of WordBank in some sense has been, if you build it, they'll eventually come, maybe with a bunch of traveling and trips and guidance about data sharing and policy and so forth. But so let's continue thinking about kind of different use cases here of how we might create these different domain-specific repositories. So going back to Childis, our original big data, this is a second data set resource that we were very interested in. And so a second project that we pursued here was actually to try to take this original big data set and put it in the same kind of interface. So we created a site called ChildisDB, which is a flexible, reproducible interface to Childis that has exactly the same tools, an API for pulling in data from Childis in a reproducible, versioned way into R or Python workflows. So you don't have to download the data set from the website, parse the format and so forth. You can just pull it directly in a pre-parsed reproducible way. And then building on that, a set of interactive visualizations. So similarly, the kind of web-based interface where you could interact with and play with the data sets. And so this kind of parasitic secondary API was a fun extension of our work with WordBank, where we were trying to say, okay, here's a different data format. Can we do the same kind of thing? Can we create a useful interface that allows students and that allows more sophisticated researchers to pull in the data? So both of these data sets have something in common, which is that they're very easy to work with. We started with easy stuff, survey data or transcript text data. These are relatively straightforward formats, and although the data in childless is big by some senses, it's not that big by the sense of modern natural language processing. We're talking about millions of words, not hundreds of millions of words. In contrast, when you look at children's early interactions, you might not just want transcripts, you might actually want a video recording of the children's life. And so we've been very interested in moving beyond just pure text data to try to work with video data. And that raises a whole host of other challenges. So I'll just tell you briefly about one project that we did trying to overcome those challenges. That project was to take a method that had been developed in the literature, which is the head-mounted camera method. So we developed our own head-mounted camera device, which is basically a camping headlamp with a little kind of matchbook camera and a fisheye lens, aftermarket iPhone fisheye lens. This is our old version of the device. We've got a cool new version that's going to come out soon. But this is the one we used for the SayCam dataset, where we distributed this to 3 households around the world. These are 3 developmental psychologists who were interested in doing this fairly onerous data collection effort, where they collected 2 hours a week of video from when their child was 6 months old to 30 months old. And you can see the kind of cuteness journey that one of these children in the data set went through. And this effort yielded more than 400 hours of video, which is, if you're keeping score, it's about 8% of the waking hours for a single year of the child's life. So this video data set then is something very different. You can't just play around with them in real time. This is a lot of video data. And so we needed to share this in a special purpose video repository. For this, we chose the Databrary repository of Rick Gilmore and Karen Adolph. This is a sort of developmental psychology specific project from NYU and Penn State that created a video sharing library. The key thing about Databrary from our perspective was that it has a very nice format where it has good privacy restrictions, such that everything in Databrary requires an institutional agreement for a login and access. So in order to access Databrary, you need to have your institution sign a terms of service that restricts cross-posting, de-identification, or re-identification, and so forth. So there are some access controls, but then once the institutional agreement is signed, you have free access to a lot of data sets, including ours, along with structured metadata about the children and about the observation sessions. So this is a nice case where we've got a domain-specific data repository that's specific for developmental videos and allows access, and I think nicely splits the difference between privacy and accessibility for our purposes. And so we're using Databrary for our new, larger egocentric video data set moving forward as well. Okay, I couldn't help but give you a little sense of some of these data. They're very noisy and very unstructured, but the world looks very different to a little kid than does to an adult. And these videos have been really instrumental through the work of a variety of different labs around the world, not just mine, in revealing some of the dynamics of children's world. So objects impinge much more closely on children's visual environment because their arms are so short. To interact with things, they really actually need to be closer to them. And they're, of course, closer to the floor. And often then the hands of the caregivers around them come in from the sides to really show them what's going on. They're, of course, closer to pets and so forth. And so they're not seeing a lot of their caregivers' faces. Instead, they're really seeing the world in a different way. So I think this is a fun, exciting methodology that really reveals something about a children's viewpoint. And critically, creating data sets like SayCam allow others to reuse these data, often in machine learning and artificial intelligence, to draw new conclusions about human learning. Okay, the final data set I want to tell you about indexes children's processing. So the process of interpreting data in real time, interpreting a language in real time that children go through as they learn about the world. And the key method for studying this was developed by my old mentor, Anne Fernald. It's called the looking while listening method. A very simple, very elegant method where you put a child in the lab, often in their caregiver's lap, and you show them pictures of, say, two objects like a cookie and a book, and you say, where's the cookie? Can you find the cookie? And then you monitor their eye movements either automatically or sometimes earlier on by hand to try to understand how their eye movements reflect their knowledge. And what you find across many, many studies with many different populations is that starting at the 0 point, when you hear that word or you see the sign, in this case, this is data from a sign language study where you see the sign for the target word, the looking to the target goes up. And it goes up very fast for adults. Before the sign or the word is even done, the adults are looking at the correct target. It's about 80% of the time. For children, for older children, it goes up relatively quickly. And for younger children, it eventually, after the sign or the word is over, gets up above chance levels of 50% to something like 60, 70%. And so this is a very, very robust set of findings with parallel results with diverse populations in the US and abroad. You get Spanish and English speakers, low and high SES, late talkers, children born premature, bilinguals, children learning ASL, and so forth. So this has really become another of these gold standard paradigms that people use in our field to measure early language. So maybe it will come as no surprise that our goal was to create, again, a flexible, reproducible interface to try to pull together data sets using this specific method, measuring this specific construct, language processing, and to make the data from all the labs around the world available to people who are interested in these kinds of data. So we created PeakBank, but these data are much more complex than the survey data or the transcript data that we had worked with. In fact, one of the things that really came out of this project was that we needed to create a complex database schema, an ontology to try to organize these data. And we had ontologies before, but they were much simpler. Really, they didn't bear a lot of discussion. Here, a key locus for our design process was figuring out the database schema. We had data sets and then administrations of for individual and then subjects who were sometimes had multiple administrations in a longitudinal study, stimuli, like a word image pairing, like ball and or a cookie and book, trial types, locations on the screen, and all of these combined to give us the moment-by-moment time course of where the child was looking at any given millisecond in the experiment. So this is a larger, much more complex data set, and it required much more effort and much more design to try to create a pipeline from the raw data sets from labs around the world through the import and validation process to this common format, this 9-table database, which we call the PeakBank database, and then the outputs from the API to download the data for research and the visualization packages for exploring the data in real time. And so this was a much more labor-intensive project that proceeded over the course, first before the pandemic and then during the pandemic, with regular hackathons in person and on Zoom, lots of folks contributing to this and really putting this project together over the course of many, many years and hours. And the result is that we can take a uniform approach to all of those scattered different curves like the one I showed you in the previous slide. So this is now about 20 odd data sets summarized, and you can see that same word recognition curve that I showed across different data sets with different degrees of variability, different populations, languages, and so forth. And this data set and database really allows us actually to do something that I was very excited about from the very beginning of our work, namely instant reproducibility. So rather than relying on that 5 to 25 hours, that IKEA flat pack approach of, okay, if I can even get the data set, I have to download it and do the same thing that they did, and I'm not exactly sure what they did. With PeakBank, if an author has deposited their data in this repository, we can very, very easily, within just a couple of lines of code, reproduce their analysis And so this is just a figure from our Peak Bank paper where we show that a classic paper in this literature from 2002, we could just pull in the data in a couple lines of code and plot the different trajectories, the different word recognition curves for correct and mispronounced words for very young children here. So this is just one classic result from our literature that we were able to reproduce with essentially no fuss or bother in just a couple of minutes, really cutting down the burden on the analyst of figuring out what was done in that previous paper, how the data were processed, and so forth. Okay, so the model I've argued for is this model of a domain-specific data repository. It's a repository that doesn't just put together data, it indexes data corresponding to specific theoretical entities in your theory of language acquisition or whatever your scientific domain is. These repositories need to have good policies to encourage contribution. They need to have good tools to allow you to import data from all the different formats of labs around the world. And they need good APIs for making access easy so that researchers can pull in those data for all the different applications they want to create. And overall, and maybe I didn't stress this enough, integration into the research community that you're trying to serve is then, of course, critical. So we're going to conferences, going to workshops, teaching people to use these data, teaching people to format and contribute their data, and then to use the data that come out. And that's a key part of this, which is education about the use of these repositories and how they can enable research. So my conviction is that data are key drivers of theory development, and policy mandates are very important. There's been some wonderful moves on that side, but just telling people to deposit their data is not enough. The data that you get are not complete or reproducible in many, many cases. So these sorts of community-led domain-specific data repositories can catalyze community standards and support theory building. And so that's the goal, is to create that field of dreams, to build these kinds of resources and to have communities catalyze around sharing the data to accelerate progress. Thank you very much.